I'm Justin Davis, and this is Drone Camps RC. If you like the honest reviews, you want to win a KOPIS 2 SE, click on the link below, and you can get entered in to win this in September 2018. So, link is going to be active down there. Click it, and support me on my videos. That would be awesome. What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to help you build the Tyro99 from Eachine. It just came out a little while back, and I've been meaning to do a build video on this for you guys. So I'm going to take the time today, and I'm going to go through this pretty thoroughly and show you guys how to build this kit. It's going to be pretty easy. Skywatch.Ai insurance is on demand, and anytime you need it, check out the link below. Alright guys, let's go ahead and get this build started. If you're thinking about building your first quad, this one's super easy. It's a 210mm frame with 2206 motors and 30 amp ESC, so a pretty sweet setup here. We've got more than a few sets of props, left and right turn bi-blade props. So those are actually going to give you a little longer flight time. The pitch does look pretty aggressive. You get some anodized aluminum parts in here. You get your battery strap. They actually give you two of these, which is nice. Those aren't the most durable things in the world. They also give you some heat shrink here, and those can go over your motor wires. You get some extra foam in there for your battery pad, and this just goes underneath your battery to protect it in a crash or when you land. And they give you this cool little keychain. Looks like a little AK-47 or something. That's kind of nice. You can put those on your car keys. And this is kind of a novelty to me. These are motor wrenches, but I really don't use these that much because they break. And we have the hardware, and we've got the Eachine camera there. This looks okay. It's kind of a stock camera, but it is 700 TVL CMOS camera, so not too hard to hook up. Actually, just one wire goes in the back, and your 3 wires come out to the flight controller, which plug in. You don't have to solder this up, which is great. And these are the 2206 motors, and these are 2150 kV, and the wires on these are actually plastic. That's the one thing that I don't like about this. If you touch a soldering iron to this wire, it's probably going to melt and expose the wire, so be real careful when you're soldering these up on your quad. And they do come clockwise and counterclockwise, so I'm going to set mine up to the traditional way, spinning right rear. You can do it the opposite way if you want, and you can switch the motors around, but I'm going to show you how those go in just a second. There's all 4 of the motors right there. And let's just see what else we got in the box here. We got the flight controller itself. The flight controller itself is actually an F4, which is great. And it does have the 6-axis gyro on board, OSD. It has an onboard LC filter. And it does have PID cycle rate on here and gyro refresh rate up to 32 kilohertz. So that's not too bad. It also supports Betaflight. And this is our VTX, which is pretty decent. We have 5.8 gigahertz, 40 channels. We have an MMCX connector there, and there's just one little cable in the box that plugs into the bottom of this. No big deal. It's also switchable up to 600 milliwatts, so a pretty decent VTX. And this is your XT60. You've got some of your camera cables in here, and everything just plug and play right there, which is great. You get some zip ties. That's also kind of useful. And this is going to be your MMCX connector with your SMA connector for your antenna, which in your antenna is right here. And that's just going to screw onto the end of that. And we have the frame itself. So there's the Tyro99 frame. And let's go ahead and start putting the frame together now. And after that, we'll start soldering. Now at this point, go ahead and take your frame out of your bag and lay everything out. I like to make everything nice and spaced apart so I can see what is what in the frame, and after that we'll start putting screws together. Alright, so the first thing you need to know here is that the smaller piece, it goes on the bottom, and you're going to put in these 4 screws first. They're going to go through both layers there. This larger piece is going to be your top layer, and you're just going to do these 4 screws at first. You don't have to tighten them super tight at this point. Just go ahead and get them semi-firm. Maybe even a little bit loose is okay, because you're going to be putting larger screws to the very end on each of the arms next. So go ahead and pick up your larger screw. This is the largest screw in the pack. Looks like that. And then you're going to grab a nut, and you're going to put the nut on the top side of the larger plate, because your anodized aluminum part is going to go crank down on top of that larger plate. So if you put the larger plate on the bottom, it's going to make your anodized aluminum frame parts not fit on top, so don't make that mistake. And there's no instructions in the box, so very easy to make that build mistake. So hopefully if you're watching this or following this along, you're not making that same mistake I did. So I did make that mistake when I first put this together. And even after 5 or more years of building quad frames, I still do make mistakes at times. And that's why live builds are always interesting. Sometimes you put some stuff together and then you do it all over again. That's just the way it goes sometimes with these frames, especially if you don't have instructions. That's why these videos are great. So I'm going to put that last nut on there, and you can take a little pair of pliers, just hold that nut on one side, and I'm just going to go ahead and put all 4 of these nuts on. And once I get them on there, I can go ahead and start to crank those down. So I'm just going to go ahead and speed up the video for you real quick so you're not watching me do that for 5 minutes. And I would say this build probably takes a few hours if you're quick, if you're really taking your time and making sure that things are nice and tight. So that's where your flight controller is going to go, those 4 holes right there. Those are your 30.5 by 30.5 stack measurements right there. And your anodized aluminum hardware is going to go on just like this on that top plate. And your flight controller and ESC is going to fit right here like this, and it should fit just barely above this stack. I mean, there is no room for error right here. So and I'm also going to show you how to get your receiver inside there, your XM Plus. A lot of you guys are using XM Plus. So I'm going to take the time to go ahead and tighten these down. I usually like to just make sure I have these nice and tight before I screw any screws into the bottom of them, because they start moving if they're not tight. And if your screw is too long and it comes up too far, you'll see the thing start to rotate, and then you're going to have a gap. So you don't want to have any gaps between this and the bottom of the frame. So that's looking pretty good there. I'm going to go ahead and remove this, and just to make things easier, just going to set the flight controller off to the side right now, because we're going to do some soldering on this plate here in just a minute. So just going to kind of fit it on here for you. We'll do that XT60 back there in a minute. And now I'm going to look for screws that fit up in here. The long ones didn't seem to fit too well. They seem to push out a little too far. And you can't use risers on it because it's going to make the stack stand up too far, and then you're not going to be able to accommodate your top rails on your frame, and that's not going to be good. So these screws are just a little bit shorter than the longest ones, and I found these in my toolkit. These did not come with the Tyro99. So that information should go out there, that some of the screws didn't quite fit right for me. They were just a little too long. And some of the medium-sized screws were a little too short. So you can see that one. And for some reason, this one was able to work. Don't ask me why. And that's kind of how things go with builds sometimes. But I have 3 really fancy titanium screws going into the bottom of this Tyro99. Not bad. After I get these tightened up, we'll move on to the next step. But so far, pretty easy, pretty painless. And let's go ahead and tin up the wires on the XT60. This is your battery connector. Just wait until it starts sizzling on the wire and you can melt the solder on the wire, and then you're going to know that you got the wire nice and hot. If the solder is not kind of sizzling on the wire, and you're not able to push the solder onto the wire and melt it, you probably don't have your wire hot enough. So you need to get your wire nice and saturated, because this part's really important. And I'm just going to go ahead and beat up as much solder as I can on both the ground and the bat on the right hand side, and the bat is going to be your positive side. Now you can just go ahead and make sure that your iron kind of connects to both parts when you're soldering this down, because you want both parts of the metal to be equally hot. And I'm sure there's some hardcore solder guys out there who's telling me that I'm doing everything wrong, but this is the way it's going to go down today. Now I'm going to need a little more solder on here. And you could clean your tip at this point, but I'm not gonna have to deal with it. So I'm gonna go ahead and melt this pad, and I'm gonna make a connection between the negative wire and that pad. And guys, be careful with your pads, because if you put too much heat to them for too long, they'll actually come off the PCB. I've had that happen a whole ton. But we should be just about good to go here with our XT60 soldered onto the ESCs. That looks pretty good, and we're going to make sure we put a zip tie on those wires somewhere, because you don't want your battery fly off the bottom of your quad and these wires to get pulled. If they get pulled at all by a battery ejecting, it'll rip these tabs right off this PCB. But that's looking pretty good. So now we can move on to the next step. Alright, now we're ready to tin up our tabs on the flight controller. Now these have holes through each of these tabs, and you could run the wire up through the bottom or through the top, either which way you would like to do it. You can do it that way. I'm going to do it the quick way, and the quick way is just to put the wire directly on top of the pad. It will absolutely work like that. I've done it on tons and tons of builds that had this same type of setup. Some people might see that as wrong, but I'm just going to, again, do it the way I like to do it, because it's worked for me for over 5 years. So I'm not going to fight something that I've been doing for a long time. This will absolutely work, and this is the quicker method. And then once you have the wires soldered down to these tabs, guys, all you have to do is just bend the wire down and underneath the ESC a little bit. And if you want to get really fancy, you can come out from underneath the ESC and bring your wire up through that hole, but it's going to take you a lot longer, and those wires don't bend easily. So next we'll go ahead and move on to the next step here. So now we're going to go ahead and choose our motor layout. This is the way I'm going to do it: right turn rear, just like always. This is the standard setup inside Betaflight, and that's how we're going to solder these up. Alright, so we're going to start out with the right rear motor, and you want to use one of the screws that look to be about, looks like the 6mm screw. And we're going to go ahead and use some Loctite on this first one. Now you can Loctite all of your motor nuts, and they're likely not to vibrate free. Just a little tiny dab. Just go ahead and wipe that off with your fingers. Wipe off the rest on your pants if you need to. And go ahead and put that bolt through there. This frame is nice and thick. Looks like about 5mm, I believe. Go ahead and take your driver and just put it through there. Not super tight right now, because we have to do a second nut. So go ahead and find the next one, and you can also put some Loctite on that one as well, or not. That's totally up to you. But what you're trying to do here is make sure that the wire harness coming off the front of the motor is in line with the arm of the quad, and that the bottom where the stator is rotating around and the shaft is coming through with that C-clamp on the bottom of the motor is not touching the frame. You don't want that to touch the frame. So a little more Loctite than I wanted that time. You can just wipe it off, no big deal. And go ahead and drive that one through. And now I just take a look, take a peep in that hole, make sure that that collar's not rubbing on the bottom of that quad frame there, that arm. So it looks like I'm good to go there with my motor wire harness coming off the front bottom of the motor. And now what we're going to do, folks, is we're going to twist all of this wire up. And what this is doing is it's going to shorten this wire a lot. Now you could do the heat shrink over top of the arms if you want to before you build the frame, or you can do it this method. So I'm just showing you a different method that's already been done. I've already seen someone else with another build video where they did the heat shrink over the arm, and that's nice too. You can do it that way. If you like to just put some zip ties around these, they will totally handle it. It won't hurt these wires. Then we're going to bend them sort of the direction they need to go. And if you need to, if you want to get fancy, if you want to make this a little nicer, you can snip these wires off and re-tin them. Make them a little bit shorter. And you can use a crimper to pull off the end of the jacket over the wire, just like this. And expose a little more of the wire now, enough to go ahead and re-tin it. And I do this on a lot of builds that I'm really taking my time on, but you don't have to. You could just kind of tuck the wire or fold it back a little bit. Just depends on how anal you are on your builds. I'll go ahead and snip the rest of that off. Now go ahead and grab your soldering iron and your TS100 hopefully, and go ahead and turn it on until it gets up to about 400 C there. That's around 800 degrees. And you're going to tin this wire. And these wires take a while to tin. So like I said, until you start seeing that sizzle, like the wire itself start to sizzle and really take that bit of solder to it, it's not going to be hot enough until then. And you can also put these in a little bit of flux to get the solder to stick a little better on this type of wire. This is not the usual wire that I see on a lot of motor wires, and definitely not the type of jacket that I see on top of this plastic wire jacket. This is definitely some thrifty stuff on the outside of these motors. Normally you'd have silicone over these, and silicone is a lot better heat resistant. You're not going to melt holes in your wire and expose your wire while you're working on it. So those are all tinned up, and now we can put our first tabs on. Now go to Harbor Freight before you start this build video and get yourself some tweezers. There is a set of tweezers at Harbor Freight that's pretty cheap. I think it's around $5, but you get all types of different tweezers, and these larger ones work really well for holding your motor wires while you're soldering them on the tabs, because if you're not holding these with tweezers, this will be so painful that you'll melt your fingers. These wires get super hot. And this is not the best quality motor wire I've ever seen, but then again, we're dealing with a budget quad here, so I think they kind of used what they had. But you just want to make sure that that wire bends over. If I can get it just good bend over horizontal, that makes it lay on the tab a lot flatter, and it's going to make a better connection with the ESC. So you want to make sure that your wire is nice and flat and not on an angle when you solder it. If your wire is kind of looking up at the sky when you solder it on, you've got a possible detachment problem there. You can have a wire just pop off. And when a wire pops off of a motor, off an ESC, and when you're flying and that happens, it can actually catch your ESC on fire, which is an amazing, interesting thing to see. I have seen it done. I've had ESC wires pop off and they just hit something else on the frame. They can even touch the carbon and arc and just fry everything. Your ESCs will be toast. So make sure that you have nice, shiny solders on each of your tabs. And again, always say to try to get heat to both the wire and the tab at the same time with your pen. And wait till you see it gets nice and hot, starts to sizzle a little bit, and you can let it go. And give it just a moment before you let go. If you feel like it went too far to the right or left, stop what you're doing and redo it. It never hurts to redo something. So there we go. Those are looking nice and shiny. And go ahead and give them a tug as well before you just settle for your solder. Then we can just tuck those wires under there, and that looks pretty neat. Not bad. So now you're going to repeat that process all the way around the quad, and make sure you twist up your motor wires nice and neat. And so you have all your solders looking good. They should be nice and shiny when you're finished. They should look like silver. They shouldn't look tarnished. If they look a little bit tarnished and flat, they're not very good. That means you got a cold solder. If you see anything that looks a little bit flat and not shiny, you might want to just reapply some heat and do that over, because you could have a wire pop off. And remember, it's not good when a wire pops off. But everything looks good here. All of my collars underneath the motors are in the perfect place. They're not touching. If you do see something there that came from the bench, like this little bolt, make sure you pay attention to your motors, because if you start up your motors, you can fry your motors pretty quickly by just a little bolt that got sucked up in the magnets while you're on the bench. So pay close attention to that. So now let's go ahead and put the flight controller back above the ESC, right above those dampened sort of bolts there. And you're going to grab this wire harness right here, and it's going to plug in on this port right here. It's going to be in the very front of the flight controller. So the teeth are actually facing on the very top part. So if you look, you'll see that the teeth are on the very top row, make sure that you have your wire harness the same direction when you plug it in, because you can bend those teeth inside there, and that's never good. Just be real careful you got it the right direction. You want to make sure that these are nice and snug. Don't push on them too much. Now tuck your wires back like this and go ahead and seat your flight controller. Look at the arrow on your flight controller and make sure that your flight controller is facing the forward part of your quad, the front of your quad. The front of your quad is always facing away from your battery terminal wires usually, unless you have a side mount battery wire set up on there. So go ahead, and I'm going to put one on there for now just to secure it, and then we'll move on to the next step here. And right now it might be a good time to just go ahead and grab your anodized aluminum side rail and just see that it fits just barely over this flight controller. Look at that, no extra space in there, barely at all. So I'm going to show you a trick to get your receiver inside there in a little bit. Alright, if you're still following along with the video, at this point go ahead and pause the video and grab all the parts for your top plate and restart the video. So that little carbon piece, a little square piece, is going to go right on the very top like this, very simply, and the SMA connector is going to go on the back like this, and it's adjustable there, so that's kind of nice. And then you're going to take one of the smaller screws and go ahead and grab your driver and some Loctite if you'd like. Wherever you have a metal to metal connection is usually where you want to have some Loctite. So go ahead and squeeze out a little bit on your bolt there, and you can dab it off or not. There's no motor, anything moving, any moving parts near this, so I don't have to be super neat with the Loctite. But whenever you're dealing with motors, you want to make sure you wipe off any excess so it doesn't fly up into the motor. And you definitely don't want to start anything until you're pretty sure a lot of this stuff has dried off. There we go. There's the second one. Now I can put this other rail on the other side, and now the top part is starting to take shape. And I didn't see any, I kind of looked through a few build videos on this quad out there and didn't really see anybody take the time to show you guys how to build this, so hopefully you guys appreciate this part. And 4 bolts, just holding that together. This thing is so easy to build. And now one more piece goes up in front of that. This might be where you put your battery strap through to put a camera on there, but that looks like that might break. That might be kind of a sad spot to put your battery strap over top of your GoPro. You might want to have some type of 3D printed TPU mount for the top of this. I'm sure there's going to be some mounts available on thingiverse.com if you have a 3D printer. That's always a good thing. If you're into quads, you should definitely get a 3D printer. You don't need really anything over like 220 millimeters squared. That's a pretty good size 3D printer. Plus you can print out frames and all kinds of cool micro brushless frames, which I do all the time. Every once in a while a really cool frame comes on Thingiverse. So now you want to take these longer bolts and you're going to drive them through the, not the bottom hole, but the one on the very top. This one right here. Just go ahead and put that through. That's going to look like that bolt right there. And this carbon is dirty, folks. There's not a lot of cleaning up after this carbon was made, after it was cut. There's a lot of dust on these frames, because my hands got pretty dirty when I was working on this. So if you take a lunch break, be sure to wash your hands. Now I'm just going to tighten that up. So now you're ready to put on your side carbon plates. And you're just going to go right on the outside like this, and it's going to protect your camera and the back side of the quad, the VTX wires that we're going to tuck underneath. Now grab one of the longer screws. It's just a little bit longer than the ones we used up top. The ones we used up top were the shorter ones, the shortest ones in the bunch. So you can see how long those screws are, just a little bit longer, maybe like 6 mil, maybe 6 millimeters long. There we go, just drive that one in there. And just make it snug. Don't over tighten these because you're screwing into metal. So if you overdo it, you're going to strip it. And by the way, if you're building this, that's a good note for you, because the hardware they included with this Eachine is not the greatest hardware. It will strip very easily. It's not good. So now you want to put your camera in there. I put my camera in there And the wire is going to plug in right here. Make sure you have the top facing top. You don't want your camera to be upside down when you turn your quad on for the first time. And then after we do that, we're going to go ahead and get the screw there. It's going to go right straight through there. And you're going to tighten that down so it gets nice and snug. So now you're ready for your other sidewall. Just go ahead and place that over top and find your first screw. And I'll go ahead and speed this part up for you guys because we already did one side. And you're going to use all the same bolts you did on the other side, the same as before. You're just going to go ahead and put everything in there like that. And now it looks good to go. So now we're ready to put the back SMA connector on the very back. So go ahead and grab this, and I'm just going to take this off first and go ahead and run it through there and put this collar back on the top part and the nut back on the very top. And now you're going to use your wrench to tighten it down. Alright, let's just go ahead and tighten that down really quickly for you. And you want to have it facing toward the inside of the quad. Make sure that this is not facing out like I have it here, because I ended up having to take it back off and put it back on the other way, because if you do it this way, then the wire is going to be exposed outside the quad. So I'm going to actually loosen that up. But you're going to use the little bit longer screws that are going to go through here. And this will be adjustable right here, so it's kind of nice. You can have it coming out more of a horizontal, or you can have it tilted up a little bit higher above the quad. And it really doesn't matter, as long as it's not hitting your props, it should be fine. Then we're going to go ahead and do that other screw on the other side. And after we do that, guys, we're ready to move on to getting some of our configuration set up. So like that is not going to work. We're going to have to go down and through and come out that top hole in the very back right there. That's what we're going to end up doing. So now we're to the point where we can take the VTX and put the VTX on top of the frame and go ahead and get that situated. So this is 3M VHB, and this is some of the best stuff in the hobby right here. Grab this at Home Depot, buy yourself like 3 rolls of it and have it in your shop, because you're going to go through tons of this stuff. I usually like to use it to secure things down, and then I'll run like a little kind of smaller zip tie around stuff, depending on where it's sitting on the frame. And this will hold it in place, and it'll have a lot less vibration on the component as well. We used to use the same stuff to hold down gyros on the back of our single rotor helis that were swinging like 700 size blades, and there was a lot of vibration. So we needed the gyro as stationary as possible, and that's what this is going to do. It's not going to let this VTX move around a lot. And you can snap in that MMCX connector like that, and you can go ahead and put it on that spot right there. But you actually want to put it a little more forward toward the camera than where you're going to see me put it here. And we're also, remember, going to move that MMCX cable underneath the frame, not outside the frame like I have it here. Now let me show you how to hook up your receiver. If we have an XM Plus for an example right here, and this is pretty easy. It looks like a little servo connector on one end, and this end right here, I'm just going to zoom into the port where it connects on the very back right here. It connects on this little tab right there. And you want to have the wires up, and you want to make sure that this is nice and snug. You can almost take a little tiny dab of hot glue and secure this. You can see it says S-Bus right there. And we are good. There's also jumpers there for PPM and iBus right next to it, depending on what you need. So now we're going to snip this off, and it depends on how long you want this wire. You don't have to have it super long, because where we're going to put it up inside the frame, you'll just have a lot of excess. So you don't really need to cut it off there. You could probably go down a little further, something like this. And then you can save this silicone wire for something else, because this is actually a pretty nice wire. Now I'm just going to pull this out and get these loose. And we're going to snip the ends of these off one by one. And now what you're going to do is you're going to tin these up. Once you have these tinned up, you can trim them back a little bit and solder them to your XM Plus. And if you've never seen an XM Plus before, this is what it looks like, how the wires need to be soldered up. So you'll see that gold button on the far left right there up at the top. Then your signal wire, your yellow one, needs to be all the way to the left, 5 volt, and then ground, just like that. So now you're just going to plug it into the flight controller at the very bottom right here where it says S bus, into that little port right there, and you should be good to go. Now you're going to set that up in beta flight, and I'm just going to test this real quick and make sure you have it plugged in the right direction. And sometimes they're a little fiddly to get plugged in. You have to have really tiny fingers for this stuff. Okay, so now it should have power to it, and if all of my soldering is right, I don't have anything like a smoke stopper plugged into this, but I'm going to go ahead and hope that everything is perfect, and I'm just going to show you that we're going to get power. And so we do have power to the receiver. Awesome. And the ESCs are chiming. Great. Now you can go ahead and grab your VTX wire, and that's going to plug into the top of the VTX right here. It's this one, and this part's going to plug into the flight controller, and your camera wire as well. It's going to plug into the very front of the flight controller, and they're both different, so this is impossible to mix this up. You won't be able to plug anything in wrong here. So I'll just get the quad, and I'll show you how they're going to plug into. This is your camera port, and then this is your VTX port right there. And I usually like to just twist these wires up a little bit, and this kind of shortens them and tidies them up a little bit. And now you want to make sure that they are facing the right way when you put the harness into the port. Usually going to be the pins up. Pins are usually facing up on flight controllers. Most every flight controller I've ever seen. So go ahead, fiddle with that for a little while like I am here, and eventually you'll get it. Just make double sure that your pins are facing the right way on both sides. It looks like I am, but you know, there we go. Make sure that's nice and firm, and flip that around and make sure that your wires aren't crossed up here. Give yourself plenty of space with your wires. I'm going to go ahead and plug that one in, and now we should be good to go. We should be almost done with this build. That wasn't too bad, was it? Now I'm going to shorten up my wires on my receiver, and we're going to tuck the receiver right on the very top underneath where the VTX is, and you're going to put a piece of VHB just in between your receiver and the frame. And we're also going to run a zip tie around both the VTX and your receiver, but you want to have your antennas facing backwards because we're going to run those out the back. This is how we're going to do this. It's probably the simplest way to do this. We're going to use a couple of zip ties to bring your antennas up and out so we get the best signal. So once we get that all secured, we can move on to the next step. We're almost done, guys. This is not bad at all. So now I've fixed that issue that I had with my VTX wire, and sometimes this is good for you guys to see. Sometimes you have to readjust things or reroute things. The first time you do things, it's sometimes not right. So what I did was I put the VTX wire underneath the quad going this direction, so it's not hanging out the back. That's definitely not going to be a good thing, having that hanging out the back. But this just all barely fits together, and it almost feels like an older build to me. A lot of times we had really crammed some stuff into a quad frame, and sometimes you really didn't know it or not, but you'd have two wires touching and you'd have white smoke come puffing out of the inside of your quad. And that's usually a bad thing because it means you fried something. So if you see a puff of white smoke, not a good build, and you did something wrong. It wasn't the manufacturer's fault, most likely, unless it was just a bad ESC. Sometimes that happens too. Sometimes you might get a bad ESC, but generally it's builder's fault when you see white smoke. Unless you plug in a bind and fly. I have plugged in bind and flies and plug and flies before and had white smoke puff out of them because they were built wrong in the factory, which is kind of crazy. But it does happen. These things are all built by hand, even in China. Hopefully not by little kids. Okay, so that looks pretty good there, and now all I really have to do at this point is get my antenna set up, get my 4 bolts on the bottom. We're just about ready to bind this up to my X7S. And one other tip for you guys, if this antenna is moving like this, there is a way to fix that. It's very simple. It drives me crazy. Sometimes they don't put heat shrink on these at the factory, and this is just a quick way to fix it. Find a piece of heat shrink, and this is all heat shrink from Harbor Freight. If you go through not a whole lot of heat shrink, Harbor Freight's a great place to get it. Those boxes of heat shrink are like $5, and I tend to order it in bulk because I go through a lot of the smaller heat shrink, putting it on top of zip ties in my antenna wires. Just go ahead and snip yourself off a piece about this long and put it up over top of the connector, but not all the way down to the bottom. And then go ahead and grab some heat, whether you have a torch or a heat gun. Just go ahead and secure that, and now that bottom part's not going to slide around on you. It's going to stay in one spot. We're going to straighten it out. Let's go ahead and straighten it out a little bit. It's a little bit hot. And move those antenna wires out of the way. Let's give it a few turns till it's nice and snug. Maybe one more sort of tiny little crank with the pliers, not too much. And now we should be good to go with our antenna. Okay, so I have VHB on the bottom of my receiver, and it's stuck underneath there on that bottom part. And this is going to give me enough clearance between the flight controller and your receiver on the bottom. And we'll just go ahead and throw a zip tie around this whole thing. Now, if you want to use a smaller zip tie, you can. This is kind of a large one, but this is what I had sitting close. And this will work. You just have to be careful that you don't push on the button that's on the very top of this VTX with this. If it's pushing on that button, it's going to change channels while you're flying. You don't want that. So you can go ahead and secure it. Make sure that this huge part of it, it's not underneath, because the flight controller is down there. You can put that out on the side. Just crank that down a little bit, and now you can snip off the excess and just move it away from that connector right there, that little button on the VTX for channels and bands and power. Switchable up to 600 milliwatt. That's not bad at all. Pretty nice VTX that comes along with this. So now everything looks pretty secure under here, and now you can bind it up to your radio. And now you're to the point where you just have to put these 4 bolts on the very bottom of the quad frame and attach your top plate, all of your top hardware, to the bottom of the quad frame here. And this is pretty simple. You just want to make sure that there's not a whole lot of pressure when you're driving these bolts through. Don't tighten up one all the way when you first put it in, because it's going to create stress on the other bolts you're trying to put in. So keep everything just a little bit loose. Screw everything down as much as you can get it until it's just almost there, and then back off of it and then start the next screw. And then once you get all 4 in, you can tighten them down. Just don't over tighten them, because you're tightening into metal. And if you want to be really anal with this, guys, you can use a little bit of Loctite on these as well. But I don't think these are going to back out. But I have landed quads before, guys, and seen bolts not on the frame, on the bottom of motors, missing bolts on the frame. Stuff does vibrate and fall out. And that one, see, that one's scoring right there. The frame needs to be moved over a little bit. And that's going to be a problem, because that's going to strip that hole. So you want to be really careful about that. Make sure that your holes are absolutely lined up. And I think I saw that one was off when I first put the top plate down. Pretty easy build though, you guys. It's getting easier all the time to build quads these days, and it doesn't take a rocket scientist. The biggest thing about this is doing this one step at a time, and just trying to take your time and do it as neat as possible. And this is one last thing you really want to do. Don't forget to do this, because if your XT60 wire gets pulled when the battery flies off the bottom of the quad, if you have a really hard crash, you're going to completely kill your ESC underneath there. The tabs are just going to fly right off. The momentum of the battery moving will just rip tabs right off a PCB. So that's looking pretty good, guys. We're pretty much done. And Now I just need to do a little zip ties on my antennas there, and I can just about be ready to go ahead and start setting this up in beta flight for you guys. So that will probably be another video. I'm going to go over this quad and do the complete setup, and I'll try to do it from scratch for you with your modes and your switches and all that stuff. And I did leave one bolt there, so I'm going to have to actually make sure that I put that bolt on your flight controller. Don't forget your bolts on your flight controller, very important. I have 3 bolts I'm missing right there, so the top's going to have to come back off. But not the end of the world. I might even be able to get those back on there without doing that. But with the exception of the different hardware that I had to use on there, you might want to order a pack of screws off Amazon. You can get them in bulk kits, and that way you'll have some various sizes. Before you start any build, it's always good to have a pile of screws somewhere, because as long as I've been building quads, I never throw screws away. I just keep throwing them in a container, and that way, and I've also started to sort them too. I'm a little bit OCD, so I know what I'm looking for when I go after it. And that way you start to build a really nice build bench. You can get those little sort of organizer drawer kits from like Harbor Freight and start organizing all your screws. Never throw any hardware away, guys. And this is one thing that bothers me a little bit about this particular quad. All these bolts on the bottom, it's going to be hard to cover all this up. These can wear on the bottom of a battery, and you can puncture the bottom of a battery, or just give excess wear to the bottom of any LiPo battery. But you want to do what you can. Maybe the fluffy side down on top of this would be a little better. But that's going to be something that you're going to have to get creative with this particular quad. And they did give you a few different pieces of foam with this that you could get creative with. They gave you this rubber pad here, and this one's supposed to go on the battery protector, but you could kind of cut this up and make it work on the bottom of this. But this is one part you're going to have to get creative with on this quad. But for the price, $99, you can't beat that. It's a really nice quad for the money. And I think it's awesome that it came with the 700 TVL camera, and that 600 milliwatt VTX is really sweet. The motors and everything on here looks pretty cool. I like it. That's the Tyro99 from Eachine, guys. I look forward to flying this a little bit later for you and doing the full review. I'm Justin Davis. I'll see you on the next one. Take care.